I think this photo right here is one of the most disturbing photos in national park history. It might look somewhat normal at first. I mean, it's just a van parked on a dirt road after all, but the story about why this van was parked there and the fate of those who parked it is incredibly disturbing. That van was found in an area that, by all reasonable accounts, should have been basically impossible for it to reach. An area so rough and inhospitable that it would go on to swallow the van's occupants whole and launch a decade-long mystery that yielded all sorts of wild conspiracy theories. Where the hell had the van's occupants disappeared to? Who were they? And of course, why and how did they manage to get their van so deep into this remote desert? The US government tried and failed to locate the van's occupants, and eventually the case basically just went cold. But then, literally years later, by the way, the case would suddenly be blown wide open due to a discovery from a private citizen with a knack for reading topography and maybe a little too much time on his hands. So with all that said, folks, this is the disturbing story of the Death Valley Germans. So this is one of the most, if not the most unique story that I've ever covered on this channel. And the reason that I say that is because it's basically two separate stories wrapped up into one. There's the story of the missing Germans, of course, but then there's also the story of the man who just about hiked himself to death trying to find them years and years later. I'm gonna attempt to tie everything together, but honestly, it might take a while, so make sure you watch all the way until the end of the video. And with that said, we're now gonna take a virtual trip to the beautiful yet dangerous Death Valley National Park. This trip is totally free, but you must hit the subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer of the channel. I appreciate you guys very much. If you're a new viewer and you end up enjoying this video, then don't worry, I give you permission to wait until the end of the video to subscribe, and I'll be sure to remind you. On October 21st, 1996, Park Ranger David Brenner was conducting some routine aerial surveillance over Death Valley National Park when he noticed an incredibly strange sight down on the ground. In the valley of Anvil Canyon, there was a seemingly abandoned minivan. I mean, just sitting there. So he sees this from the sky, and as soon as he saw it, by the way, this ranger knew that something had to have gone wrong and that this vehicle needed to be investigated immediately. And so he landed his small plane nearby and he walked over to check out this van. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, the area that this minivan was located in is incredibly remote, it's rugged, and especially in the summertime, I mean, it's extremely dangerous. I'm sure many of you already know this, or perhaps you've heard this, but Death Valley is known for being literally the hottest place on Earth. It's totally unforgiving, and it's claimed many, many lives over the years. So back to this minivan, it turned out to be a green Plymouth Voyager, and the road that it was found on, I mean, you can't even really call it a road. I mean, it was basically an abandoned path that had not been used in years. This road was also located within a designated wilderness area, which meant that vehicles were prohibited from traveling on it. And with that said, however, it's not exactly unheard of for folks to ignore the law and ride their like recreational or four-wheel drive vehicles in these remote areas. Obviously, that does happen. But again, this wasn't a side-by-side. This wasn't a four-wheeler. I mean, this vehicle didn't even have four-wheel drive. It was just a standard minivan. It was like a soccer mom van, essentially, right? It's pretty much the last type of vehicle that you would expect to find on a long since abandoned remote dirt road. Whoever had driven the van to this location must have been either extremely skilled at driving or extremely lucky to have made it that far down the abandoned path. I mean, by conventional wisdom, it would have seemed pretty much impossible for this van to be where it was without it basically being airdropped by a plane or a helicopter or something. But obviously that's ridiculous. It was clear at the scene that the van had not been airdropped and had somehow traveled through the rough terrain all the way until its final resting place. And we know this because 3 out of the 4 tires on the van were completely flat, and it was just stuck there in the sand. So Ranger Brenner, who found this van, recorded the license plate, he reported it, and it's at this point in the story that the details behind this mysterious van began to unravel, at least some of these details. And so with that said, things are definitely about to take a disturbing turn. And so before we get to that stuff, I want to take a breather for just a second here and tell you about Aura. That's right, Aura is the sponsor of this video. So some of you guys might have heard this recently, but you probably didn't hear about it, to be honest. A few months ago, AT&T revealed that over 73 million customer records, both existing and former customers, by the way, were released publicly on the dark web. I'm an AT&T customer myself, actually, and I didn't even hear about this until I started, working with Aura. I mean, AT&T messed up big time, and all that they did in response was to just make some recommendations for those affected, things like using strong passwords, monitoring your account, and considering credit freezes or fraud alerts. So like having to do all that stuff is a huge pain, right? Especially separately, by the way, you gotta manage all these different things. But thankfully, this is where our sponsor Aura comes in. Aura can do all of those things for you with just their one app. And I mean, that's literally just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what they can do. Aura will also provide you with a VPN, an antivirus, a password manager, identity theft insurance, and much, much more. And again, all this stuff just from one app and for one low price. I absolutely love Aura. They've been a long sponsor now. I've been using it for months and months and months. And they're basically a one-stop shop for all things related to your online security and your identity protection. So with that said, I highly recommend you check them out. You can let people continue to exploit and profit off of your private information, or you can go to aura.com/KyleHatesHiking and get yourself a 14-day free trial. You can also click that link at the top of the description. One more time, aura.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go get that free trial. And when you click our links, by the way, it's a massive, massive favor to the channel. So I really appreciate everyone who does that stuff. And with that said, let's get back to the story. So they ran the plates of this abandoned minivan, and they found out that it was a rental. In fact, it had actually been reported stolen out of Los Angeles by its owner, which was Dollar Car Rentals, and it was reported stolen about a month-ish before it was discovered. And so, naturally, the question is, who were the last people to have the car before it disappeared? And the last people that had rented it were actually a group of German tourists. They were 34-year-old Egbert Rimkus, his 11-year-old son, George Weber, Egbert's 28-year-old girlfriend named Cornelia Connie Mayer, and then her 4-year-old son named Max Mayer. Now, the Germans had been supposed to return the rental car on July 26th, but despite not doing this, not returning it, the rental car company actually waited over a month before they finally reported it stolen. So the fact that they never returned the car was obviously very concerning. But what was even more concerning, potentially, was that the Germans had booked a return flight out of Los Angeles on July 27th, but they never boarded this flight. They never showed up, and no other flight records or any indication that they had left the United States was ever found. So using the very few clues available to them, the authorities began piecing together the German group's timeline. I mean, they were trying to understand how their vehicle had ended up in such a remote and desolate place. So they did all this research, and here's basically what they found. The Germans had landed in Los Angeles on July 8th, rented that minivan, and then spent about a week sightseeing around San Clemente, California. They actually found a camera roll, like a film camera roll inside the van, and so they developed those photos And through this, investigators discovered that the Germans had traveled to Las Vegas next, and then they went on to Death Valley National Park. By the time they got there, the date was July 22nd, which is quite literally the hottest time of the year in the hottest place on Earth. Inside of the minivan, investigators also found a few opened and unopened bottles of Bud Ice beer. They found some camping equipment, they found a few bank cards, and they found several empty, completely empty containers for water. They continued to piece together the Germans' timeline, and thanks to a few remote logbooks the group had signed out in the national park, investigators were able to determine that on July 23rd, the Germans had tried to drive an extremely rough road over Mengel Pass. We don't know exactly what happened here, but we do know that they couldn't make it. And so they eventually changed directions and headed down into Anvil Canyon, which is where their vehicle eventually gave out on them. The estimated temperature for the area that day was a high of 107 degrees Fahrenheit, or roughly 42 degrees Celsius. By October 23rd, as investigators were still piecing everything together, mind you, a search was finally launched, or more likely at that point, I think it would be safe to say it was a body recovery mission, unfortunately. And on this search, it didn't take very long before another important clue was discovered, and searchers probably felt that they would be closing out the mystery of the Death Valley Germans very quickly at this point. On this search, they found an empty Bud Ice beer bottle roughly 1.7 miles east of where the minivan was abandoned. The scene kind of looked like someone had sat down next to this bush, probably to try to get some shade, because again, this is the desert, it's super hot, there's no trees or anything, is my understanding. So they sat down and maybe they drank this beer, or they had it with them, and then they just kind of left it there. This recovered beer bottle was matched with the other beer bottles that were found in the minivan, so they didn't believe it was a coincidence. They were pretty confident that it was left there by somebody who was in that van. Though this was definitely a promising initial clue, it was pretty much the only clue that the first search discovered. And by the way, this first search was a massive effort. I'm talking over 200 people searching, multiple helicopters. I mean, they had horses, and they spent roughly equivalent to $150,000 in today's money, and yet no sign of the Germans was found. They searched and searched, but then eventually on October 26th, the search was called off. So this case is obviously super strange so far and just very perplexing. And because of that, it received quite a bit of news media attention at the time. And because of that, in the years that followed 1996, a number of search and rescue teams, as well as just private individuals, conducted their own unofficial searches. On these searches, a few potential clues were found, mainly a discarded sleeping bag and 2 alleged German canteens, but these clues were never definitively tied to the missing Germans. And so, as tends to happen in cases like this, as the case grew colder and colder and more time went by, theories and speculation obviously grew stronger and stronger. One theory was that Egbert Rimkus wanted to sneak onto the nearby China Lake Naval Air Weapons Station, and in the process of doing this, he basically ended up being disappeared by the government after maybe seeing something that he shouldn't have. I don't know about that. Another theory was that they ran into some sort of foul play while driving through the backcountry, and then their bodies were disposed of and the van was ditched as a result. Again, I don't know. Some people even believed that they were abducted by aliens. I mean, I'm telling you, there was all sorts of wild stuff going around. In fact, one of the most popular conspiracy theories, I guess, if you could even call it that, was that the Germans had pulled off an elaborate scheme to stage their disappearance and then run off to start new lives. Apparently, Egbert had been going through some custody troubles with his ex-wife back in Germany, which I guess would have given him a possible motive to run off like this. And he also apparently had been talking a lot before he disappeared about like up and moving to Costa Rica or something. So I don't know, there were all these theories and, you know, the case was getting a lot of attention, but no like hard evidence or even soft evidence for that matter of any of these conspiracy theories existed. But with that said, there is of course one more theory that could have explained the disappearance of the Death Valley Germans. And this theory wouldn't have been popular with the folks, you know, going through these wild theories and stuff, but it was probably the most obvious explanation. This theory held that the Germans had simply made some bad decisions, gotten lost as a result, then the van broke down, and then they had no choice but to try to walk through the desert back to safety, and well, they died while doing that. However, skeptics argued that this was basically impossible because of how thoroughly the area had been searched following their disappearance. I mean, if they were still in the desert, within walking distance, of course, from the abandoned van, surely they would have been found, right? Well, according to a man named Tom Mahood, the answer to that question was no, not necessarily. Tom Mahood theorized that the bodies were still, in fact, out there. And over 10 years after the case had gone cold, he set out on foot himself to prove it. At the beginning of the video, I told you this was like two different stories wrapped up into one. Well, this is the start of the second part, I guess, of this overall story. Tom Mahood was a private citizen who, in 2008, became oddly obsessed with the case of the missing Death Valley Germans. My understanding is that the case inspired him to join a local volunteer search and rescue team called Riverside Mountain Rescue Unit, like the year after he discovered the case, where he then began honing his search skills and also picking the brains of other members of the search and rescue team about the case. Tom Mahood then spent most of 2009 researching about the Germans and their disappearance, hoping that he would somehow uncover some new information that hadn't been readily available in the media and at this point online. Mahood felt as though something was missing in the public reporting about this case. He just felt like there had to be more. Something just wasn't right. And so he just started digging. He dug and dug. He spent countless hours poring over topography maps of the area before finally setting out to visit the minivan site himself in October of 2009. Tom Mahood was able to obtain the GPS coordinates of where the van was found, and also he was able to get the coordinates of where the empty bottle of beer was found further down the trail. He parked at the remote Anvil Canyon, and then he set out, like I said earlier, on foot through this desolate desert. He eventually reached the location of the van, which had long since been removed, by the way, obviously, and he then climbed up to a vantage point to take some photos, later saying, quote, "As I climbed up on the bank of the wash to the south to take overall pictures, it suddenly struck me that Egbert probably did the same thing and was at the same spot on the bank to get an overview of where they were. It was a very eerie feeling." Tom Mahood then continued on to the bottle site before eventually returning back to his car. He ended up hiking about 12 miles in 7 hours, and this is some hard hiking, by the way. And even though he was exhausted by the end, this initial visit to the desert would prove to be incredibly useful for him. He didn't discover any new clues necessarily, but simply just placing himself in the exact same spot that the Germans had been before they disappeared. I mean, this is incredible. It allowed him, in a sense, I guess, to kind of put himself in their shoes. He, quote, "soaked up the ambience of the area," and he also took a first-hand look at what the Germans were dealing with when their van eventually gave out on them. A few days after Mahood returned home, his hike through the desert ended up paying off big time, because suddenly, a very promising theory, one that fit with all the known information and all the clues, well, it kind of just jumped out to him. Tom Mahood said, quote, "On October 29th, only 2 days after my hike, I was at home looking at an overall map of Death Valley. Like viewing one of those optical illusions where an image suddenly pops out, everything just fell into place and became visible. I suddenly saw a way the Germans could have ended up in Anvil Canyon through a series of reasonable, honest mistakes. So he comes up with this theory, and by the way, this theory was incredibly detailed and honestly incredibly complicated, especially if you're not really familiar with this area. I'm gonna do my absolute best to explain it in like simple terms, though I will say that if you'd like an even more detailed view into the theory and his entire mission for that matter, he wrote up an excellent blog about this case that I will link in the description. In fact, much of the information that I'm sharing with you today has been derived from his blog, and so once again, I suggest you go check it out, especially if you want even more information about this case. So there were basically two unknown questions that Mahood had to kind of formulate a theory around. These questions were, number one, why did the Germans' van end up where it did? And second of all, what the hell happened to them after the van broke down? Mahood knew that the Germans had purchased a Death Valley guidebook that apparently highlighted several routes through the desert that weren't exactly suitable for a minivan, to put it lightly. He thought that it seemed likely that the Germans didn't understand how bad the roads would be, and so they kind of set out and made it all the way to Mengel Pass before realizing they couldn't go any further and then turning around. But rather than just retracing the route that they came in on, they were looking at the map and they decided to take a gamble in order to save some time on their trip, which caused them to eventually turn onto Anvil Canyon Road. They had been in the United States for a little while at this point. Their trip was coming to an end, but they still wanted to go see Yosemite National Park after leaving Death Valley, and they probably feared that they would run out of time to make this last trip if they had to kind of retrace their steps and drive out the way that they came in. And so, yeah, they took a gamble. They went on this road that was extremely rough, and they went as far as they could, but eventually the van's tires, they gave out, and the group was essentially stranded in the desert in the middle of the summer. Mahood believed that after the van broke down, Egbert then walked the roughly 1.7 miles down Anvil Canyon to try and formulate a plan, I guess. And on this walk, he eventually stopped to try to sit in the shade next to this little bush and apparently drank a beer. He then left the bottle at this location and hiked back to the van, which is where the group apparently would have spent the night. He believes that the group spent at least one night at the van because cat holes were found nearby, which, if you don't know what that means, it basically means they had been digging holes to go to the bathroom, which indicates that they were at that location for at least some extended period of time. So that explains, why they ended up where they did, where the van broke down, but it doesn't explain where they went next or what happened, how they disappeared. And so let's get into that part of Mahood's theory now. Mahood believes that Egbert noticed the China Lake Naval Weapons Center on his map of the Death Valley area. Now, in Germany or just in Europe in general, I guess, military installations like this are routinely patrolled on foot. And so Egbert would have assumed that if he could reach China Lake, he would encounter soldiers or guards, something like that, that could, help out the stranded family. And this is obviously a very reasonable assumption for an international traveler in the US. But unfortunately, there were basically two main problems with this assumption. First of all, the China Lake Naval Weapons Center's property was not patrolled. And second of all, it was a treacherous 9-mile off-trail bushwhack in order to get there on foot. And with limited information at their disposal, the Germans probably underestimated just how dangerous this trek would be. And thus, the morning after they crashed the van, they locked it, and then they headed south on foot through the scorching desert into the last area that had not been searched after their disappearance. So that's essentially all of Mahood's theory. Again, I kind of dumbed it down a little bit, and you can read that blog to learn more. But after coming up with this theory, he plotted out a few potential southbound routes that the Germans might have taken on foot. And then, on November 11th, 2009, Mahood and one of his fellow search and rescue buddies named Les Walker set out on a multi-night journey to try and cover these tracks. Tom Mahood had his theory at this point, and so this trip was now the time to put it to test. So the men spent the first day kind of hiking in and finding and gathering water, and then setting up like a base camp to kind of come back to every night. And so they do this, and then the next morning they wake up and they just started searching, right? They were eager to cover as much ground as they could in the limited amount of time that they had. They picked one of the routes, and then the two men spread out, roughly 100 yards away from each other, too far to talk, and so they each had these little radios that they used to communicate. The area that these two men were trying to cover was absolutely massive. So massive, in fact, that Mahood immediately realized that it would take multiple trips to search as he was kind of looking out over all this terrain. And also, just in case you needed a reminder, the men were miles away from any established trail in an area so remote that there was likely only a few people in history that had ever laid eyes on what they were looking at. The only reason that I even mention that is because I just think it's important context to show just how miraculous the next series of events I'm about to tell you about were. So again, this is like the very first morning of the search. They get up, they start searching around 7 a.m., and then, not even 2 hours later, at 8:43 a.m., Tom Mahood heard a radio message from Walker that would blow the mystery of the Death Valley Germans literally wide open. Les Walker had found a discarded wine bottle, and this bottle looked quite old. Then, Walker found a few pieces of scrap paper, and on them were words that were written in, you guessed it, German. And then, shortly after this discovery, Walker announced over the radio, quote, "Tom, we have some bones here." At this point, Tom Mahood quickly raced down to join Walker, and as he was doing this, as he was moving over to kind of intercept his location, Walker found a wallet. And inside this wallet was multiple ID cards, and they all bore the name Cornelia Mayer. This confirmed that the two men acting on Mahood's theory had indisputably solved a massive piece of the Death Valley Germans mystery. The men continued searching around, and they did find a few more items, which included another Bud Ice beer can that matched the ones that were found in the van. And then after all these discoveries, obviously they were really onto something. And so they decided at this point to hike out and report their findings to the authorities. But before they left, they actually grabbed Cornelia's IDs in order to prove what they had discovered. So they hiked out through this incredibly difficult terrain, and eventually they reached their vehicle, and they just started speeding straight towards the nearest ranger station. The men would then report their findings, and within days, the site of those remains would be swarming with investigators, searchers, and even FBI agents. Even more items would go on to be recovered over various trips to the site, and ultimately, the only DNA match on the remains was that of Egbert, although it is likely that some of the bones belonged to Cornelia as well. I mean, that makes sense, right? Especially given her wallet was found at the site. Unfortunately, part of this mystery remains all the way up until today, because the remains of the children were never found. Although possibly some of the bones might have appeared to be that of a child. We don't really have any conclusive evidence of this, but it is certainly a possibility, yeah. Mahood would end up going back multiple times after his initial discovery, at first to kind of, assist investigators since he was the one that discovered it and stuff, and then later to actually search for more clues. His repeated expeditions into the backcountry would end up taking a toll on his health, and after failing to find any new evidence, particularly of the children's fate, that's what he was kind of looking for at this point, he eventually retired from the case. I used air quotes there because, once again, Mahood was not acting in any, like, official capacity during his searches for the Death Valley Germans, which, by the way, brings me to a very important point. When Mahood and Walker first reported their discovery to the authorities, they were actually given kind of an earful. They were scolded, essentially, and the reason for this is because the government does not like the idea of private citizens going out and potentially putting themselves at risk, or people that would then have to come rescue them at risk, you know, just trying to be the hero who solves one of these famous cold cases. And I definitely understand that sentiment, but with that said, Mahood was an experienced hiker. He had like actual search and rescue experience and training, so he was definitely very well equipped for this challenge. However, I just gotta say, unless you yourself fall into that same category, I cannot stress this enough, you should not, under any circumstance, take Mahood's story as like inspiration to go out and try to replicate his actions and success. Again, if you're like a search and rescue professional, you have all this experience, then, you know, I can't tell you what to do, but if you're not experienced in the backcountry and you do this, you're very likely to get into trouble, and it could also very likely cost you your life. So don't even think about it. No, that's just an important point I had to make. And though Tom Mahood was acting independently, as I mentioned earlier, he was a member of the Riverside Mountain Rescue Unit, at least at some point in time. And thus, because of that, I've decided to make them my give back call out for this video. They're a volunteer, emphasis on the volunteer, search and rescue group. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but I have made a donation to them, and I'd encourage you to check out their website, and please consider doing the same, even if it's just like a few bucks or whatever. Volunteer search and rescue members are the unsung heroes of the backcountry. I keep saying this, and it's so true, so please join me in my mission to support them. Ultimately, it seems as though the Death Valley Germans made it roughly halfway to the China Lake Naval Air Weapons Station before, tragically, but also unsurprisingly, succumbing to either like heat exhaustion or dehydration. Now, of course, we're never gonna know like their exact reasoning behind, you know, driving the van to where they did and then all of that. But I don't know, I still think it's worth noting that you should definitely not ever attempt to follow remote roads that you have no information about or no intel on, especially in a place like Death Valley in the middle of the summer. If you do venture into the wilderness here, please bring tons of extra water and leave your plans with somebody just in case something goes wrong. I'd once again highly recommend that you go read Tom Mahood's full blog linked in the description, especially if you found this story fascinating. And if you enjoyed this video and you haven't yet done so, please consider subscribing to the channel and helping us get just a little bit closer to our goal of 1 million subscribers. We have a long ways to go, but I ain't stopping anytime soon. But much more importantly than that, please, everybody, be safe out there. And also, please keep Egbert Rimkus, George Weber, Cornelia Mayer, and Max Mayer in your hearts. YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, so go give it a watch right now. And thank you all so much. Like, seriously, you know, it's just been so crazy on this channel. Thank you all so much for supporting my content.